The blizzard had been raging for 3 days straight across the outskirts of Burlington, Vermont, transforming the world into a vast white canvas that seemed to muffle even the sharpest sounds. From his position behind the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of his estate, Richard Whitmore watched the snow fall with the same detached interest he had observed everything else for the past 4 years. The wheelchair beneath him had become as much a part of his identity as his piercing blue eyes, or the silver streaks that had appeared in his dark hair since that terrible day when everything changed. The mansion around him stood as a testament to his former life, a life where he had commanded boardrooms, negotiated multi-million-dollar deals, and traveled the world with his beloved wife, Catherine, and their 8-year-old daughter, Emma. Now, the 45-year-old tech mogul existed in a carefully orchestrated routine that revolved around remote business management and the minimal human contact required to maintain his empire. "Mr. Whitmore, your evening medication," announced Margaret, his live-in nurse, approaching with her usual professional demeanor. She had been with him since his discharge from the rehabilitation center, a competent woman in her 50s who understood the delicate balance between caring for him and respecting his fierce independence. Richard nodded without turning from the window. The house had been completely redesigned after the accident. Ramps installed throughout, doorways widened, bathrooms modified. Every detail had been meticulously planned to accommodate his new reality, yet somehow it all felt like a beautiful prison, where memories of laughter and footsteps running down hallways haunted every corner. "The quarterly reports are on your desk," Margaret continued, setting down a glass of water beside his wheelchair. "And Thomas called to confirm tomorrow's conference call with the Tokyo office." Thomas Bradley had been Richard's assistant for over a decade, one of the few people who had remained constant through the transformation of his life. Even Thomas, however, had learned to communicate primarily through emails and brief phone calls, understanding that his employer's tolerance for prolonged human interaction had diminished significantly. As Margaret's footsteps faded down the hallway, Richard returned his attention to the storm outside. The property extended for several acres, surrounded by a mixture of dense forest and abandoned buildings that had once been part of a small textile mill from the early 1900s. He had purchased the entire area not for its historical significance, but for the isolation it provided. The security system he had installed was state-of-the-art, with cameras positioned strategically throughout the property. It had become a nightly ritual for him to review the feeds, not out of fear, but from a need to maintain control over his environment. Control had become his anchor in a world that had proven itself capable of destroying everything he held dear in a single moment. Tonight, as he navigated through the various camera angles on his tablet, something caught his attention. Near the old mill building, partially obscured by the swirling snow, 2 small figures huddled against the brick wall. Richard leaned forward, adjusting the camera angle and increasing the zoom. His breath caught in his throat as the image became clearer. 2 children, girls by the look of them, wrapped in what appeared to be a single threadbare blanket, pressed against the building's wall for shelter. The older child, perhaps 8 or 9, had her arms wrapped protectively around a smaller figure who couldn't have been more than 5. Even through the grainy security footage, Richard could see them shivering violently against the bitter cold. For a moment, he sat frozen, staring at the screen. The protective embrace of the older child stirred something deep within him that he had carefully buried for 4 years. The image of Emma's face flashed through his mind, not the peaceful expression from their final moment together, but her bright smile from countless bedtime stories and morning pancakes. His hands trembled as he reached for the intercom system that connected throughout the house. "Margaret," he called, his voice hoarse with emotion he hadn't felt in years. "Margaret, I need you to come to my office immediately." Within minutes, the nurse appeared at his door, her expression shifting from professional calm to concern as she saw his face. "Mr. Whitmore, what's wrong? Are you feeling unwell?" "Look at this," Richard said, turning the tablet toward her. "Near the old mill, there are children out there." Margaret squinted at the screen, her eyes widening as she recognized the small figures. Dear God, in this weather, they'll freeze to death. Call Thomas, tell him to bring the SUV around immediately, and gather some blankets, warm clothes, anything we have that might fit. Children. Richard's voice carried an authority that had been absent for years, the commanding tone that had once driven his business empire. Sir, are you certain? Perhaps we should call the authorities. There's no time, Richard interrupted, already maneuvering his wheelchair toward the hallway. By the time they respond, those children could be... He stopped himself, unable to voice the thought that had driven him to action. Margaret nodded, understanding the urgency in his voice. I'll call Thomas and gather supplies. What about you? You haven't left the house in over a year. Richard paused at the top of the ramp that led to the main floor. For a moment, doubt crept into his mind. What was he doing? He was a man in a wheelchair, emotionally shattered, living in isolation by choice. What could he possibly offer two children caught in a blizzard? But then he thought of Emma, of how she used to curl up in his lap during thunderstorms, trusting him completely to keep her safe. These children had no one, and he couldn't simply watch them suffer when he had the means to help. I'm going with you, he said firmly, beginning his descent down the ramp. Prepare the guest rooms on the main floor. And Margaret, call Dr. Peterson. Tell him we may need medical attention for hypothermia. As he waited for Thomas to arrive with the vehicle, Richard found himself moving through the house with a purpose he hadn't felt in years. The rooms that had felt like a mausoleum suddenly seemed to hold possibility. He instructed Margaret to turn up the heat and prepare hot beverages, his mind working with a clarity that surprised him. The drive to the mill took less than 10 minutes, but it felt like hours. Through the SUV's windows, Richard could see the children more clearly now. The older girl had positioned herself to shield the younger one from the wind, her small body trembling with cold, but her posture unwavering in its protective stance. There, Richard pointed as Thomas pulled as close as possible to the building. Carefully now, they're probably terrified. Margaret approached the children slowly, her voice gentle and reassuring. Hello, sweethearts, we're here to help you. Are you hurt? The older girl looked up with eyes that held far too much wariness for someone her age. She clutched the smaller child closer, her voice barely audible over the wind. We're not doing anything wrong, we just needed somewhere warm. I know, honey, Margaret said, crouching down to their level. We want to help you get warm. This is Mr. Whitmore, and he has a big house nearby with hot food and warm beds. Richard had remained in the SUV, unsure of how his presence might affect the frightened children. But as he watched the scene unfold, he felt compelled to act. Despite the difficulty of transferring from the vehicle to his wheelchair in the snow, he managed with Thomas's help. Hello, he said softly, approaching the children. My name is Richard. What are your names? The older girl studied him for a long moment, her gaze taking in his wheelchair without judgment. I'm Sarah, she whispered. This is my sister, Lily. Sarah and Lily, Richard repeated, his voice gentle. Those are beautiful names. Sarah, you've been taking very good care of your sister, but she's very cold, isn't she? And so are you. Sarah nodded, her lower lip trembling not just from cold, but from the weight of responsibility she carried. I tried to keep her warm, but the blanket got wet, and I don't know. How you did exactly the right thing, Richard assured her. You're a brave big sister, but now let us help you both get warm and safe. As Margaret wrapped the children in dry blankets and helped them into the SUV, Richard felt something shift inside him. The hollow ache that had been his constant companion for 4 years remained, but it was joined by something else, a flicker of purpose that he had thought was gone forever. The drive back to the house was quiet, except for the children's occasional sniffles and the gentle reassurances Margaret offered. Richard found himself studying their faces in the rearview mirror, noting the way Sarah maintained her protective vigilance, even as exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her, and how little Lily seemed to trust her sister completely to keep her safe. When they arrived at the mansion, Richard supervised as Margaret helped the children inside. The warmth of the house seemed to envelop them immediately, and for the first time since he had spotted them on the security camera, Richard allowed himself to believe they would be all right. Let's get you both into warm baths and dry clothes. Margaret said, guiding them toward the guest rooms. And then we'll have some hot soup and cocoa. As the children disappeared down the hallway with Margaret, Richard remained in the foyer, staring at the wet footprints they had left on the marble floor. Such small prints, yet they seemed to have disturbed something fundamental in the carefully ordered silence of his home. He had acted on instinct, driven by a protective urge he thought had been buried with his own daughter. But now, as the immediate crisis passed, questions began to surface. Who were these children? Where had they come from? And most importantly, what would happen to them now? The blizzard continued to rage outside, but within the walls of the mansion something had shifted. For the first time in 4 years, Richard Whitmore had allowed the outside world to penetrate his carefully constructed isolation, and he wasn't sure if he was prepared for what that might mean. Dawn broke over the Vermont landscape with a crystalline clarity that only followed the most severe winter storms. Richard had not slept. Instead, he had spent the night in his office, periodically checking on the children through the baby monitor Margaret had thoughtfully placed in their room. The sound of their breathing, soft and steady, had become an anchor in the long dark hours before sunrise. The girls had been examined by Dr. Peterson, who had arrived despite the treacherous road conditions. His diagnosis was reassuring: mild hypothermia, exhaustion, and malnutrition, but nothing that couldn't be treated with warmth, rest, and proper care. Still, Richard found himself unable to shake the image of their small forms huddled against the mill wall, so vulnerable and alone. "They're asking for you," Margaret announced as she entered his office, carrying a tray with his usual morning coffee and what appeared to be an extra cup of hot chocolate. Lily won't eat her breakfast and Sarah keeps looking toward the door. Richard set aside the financial reports he had been pretending to read. "Asking for me?" "Well, Sarah asked if the nice man in the chair was still here. I think she's afraid you might disappear." Margaret's expression was knowing. "It's been 4 years since we've had children in this house, Mr. Whitmore. Perhaps it's time." The weight of her words settled over him as he made his way to the guest room. Sarah and Lily were sitting on the edge of one of the twin beds, both dressed in pajamas that Margaret had somehow procured. Sarah in a pink set with little flowers, Lily in lavender with cartoon cats. Their dark hair had been brushed and their faces scrubbed clean, revealing features that spoke of intelligence and resilience despite their obvious youth. "Good morning," Richard said softly, positioning his wheelchair near the bed but not too close. "Did you sleep well?" Sarah nodded, though her eyes remained watchful. "Thank you for helping us. We don't usually ask for help from strangers." "You're very welcome," Richard replied. "And I understand about being careful with strangers. That's smart." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Sarah, can you tell me how you and Lily ended up at the mill? Do you have family we should contact?" The question brought a shadow across Sarah's face. She instinctively pulled Lily closer, and the younger girl, who had been quietly sipping her hot chocolate, looked up with wide, trusting eyes that reminded Richard painfully of Emma. "Our mama went to find food," Sarah said carefully. "She told us to wait in the warm place, but when the snow got really bad, we had to find somewhere else. She said she'd come back when the storm stopped." Richard felt his chest tighten. "When did she leave, Sarah?" 3 days ago," Sarah whispered. "When the snow first started falling. She said the store was only a little ways away, but..." Her voice trailed off, and Richard could see the fear she was trying so hard to hide. Margaret, who had been standing quietly in the doorway, stepped forward. "Sarah, honey, did your mama tell you where she was going? What store?" Sarah shook her head. "She just said she was going to get food. We were staying in the old building because..." She glanced at Lily, clearly debating how much to reveal. "Because it was safe there. Mama said we couldn't go back to the other place." The pieces of their story began to form a troubling picture in Richard's mind. 2 young girls alone in an abandoned building during a blizzard, with a mother who had disappeared 3 days ago. The implications were heartbreaking, but he forced himself to remain calm for their sake. "Well," he said gently, "you're safe now, and you'll stay safe until we figure out what to do next. Would you like to see more of the house? There's a library with lots of books and a room with games and puzzles." For the first time, Lily spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you have princess books?" Richard felt his heart constrict. Emma had loved princess stories, especially the ones where the princess was brave and rescued herself. "I think we might have some princess books. Would you like to look?" The transformation in both children was remarkable. Sarah's shoulders relaxed slightly, and Lily actually smiled, a shy but genuine expression that lit up her small face as they made their way through the house. Richard found himself seeing his home through their eyes, the soaring ceilings, the artwork on the walls, the comfortable furniture that had sat unused for so long. The library, in particular, seemed to captivate them. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls, filled with volumes Richard had collected over the years. In one corner sat a child-sized reading nook that had been Emma's favorite spot, complete with colorful cushions and a small bookshelf filled with children's literature. "This was my daughter's special place," Richard said quietly as the girls approached the reading nook. "She loved to read here. You're welcome to use it while you're staying with us." Sarah looked up at him with new curiosity. "Where is your daughter now?" The question hit him like a physical blow, but Richard had learned to navigate these moments. Over the years, she's not with us anymore, but she would have liked you both very much. Something in his tone must have conveyed the depth of his loss, because Sarah reached out and gently touched his hand. "I'm sorry," she said simply. "It's sad when people go away." The wisdom in her words, spoken with such matter-of-fact compassion, nearly undid him. Here was a child who clearly understood loss intimately, offering comfort to him. Richard cleared his throat and managed a small smile. "Thank you, Sarah. That's very kind of you to say." As the day progressed, Richard found himself drawn into the children's world in ways he hadn't expected. Margaret had set up activities in the main living room, and gradually, the sounds of childhood began to fill the house again. Lily's delighted laughter when she discovered a puzzle with pictures of castles, Sarah's careful questions about the books she was examining. During lunch, Richard learned more about their situation. The girls had been living with their mother in what Sarah described as the apartment with the angry man. From her careful descriptions, Richard gathered that they had been in an unsafe domestic situation, possibly with an abusive partner of their mother's. "Mama said we had to leave because the angry man was getting worse," Sarah explained as she helped Lily with her sandwich. "She said we would find a better place to live, but first we had to hide until it was safe." "Your mama sounds very brave," Richard said, though his heart ached for what these children had endured. "She was trying to protect you." "She always protects us," Lily said with absolute certainty. "She'll come back when the snow stops." Richard exchanged a look with Margaret, who had been quietly listening to the conversation. They both understood the likelihood that the children's mother might not return, but neither wanted to destroy the hope that was clearly sustaining them. That afternoon, Richard made several phone calls. He contacted the local police to report, finding the children and described their situation. He also reached out to child services, though he was careful to emphasize that the girls were safe and well cared for in his home. The social worker he spoke with, a woman named Janet Morrison, promised to come by the next day to assess the situation. As evening approached, Richard found himself in an unusual position, sitting in his living room with two children who seemed to have accepted his presence as part of their new normal. Sarah had claimed the spot on the couch nearest to his wheelchair, while Lily had settled on the floor with her coloring books, occasionally looking up to show him her artwork. "Mr. Richard," Lily said, holding up a drawing of what appeared to be a house with three figures standing in front of it. "This is us, see? That's you in your special chair, and that's me and Sarah." Richard studied the drawing, noting how she had carefully drawn his wheelchair with what looked like cape attached to the back. "Hey, it's beautiful, Lily. What's this flowing behind my chair?" "That's your superhero cape," she explained matter-of-factly. "Sarah said you're like a superhero because you saved us from the cold." Richard's throat tightened with emotion. "Well, I think Sarah is the real superhero. She took care of you very well." Sarah looked up from her book, her expression serious. "We take care of each other. That's what families do." The word family hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning that Richard wasn't sure he was ready to explore. These children had lost their mother, were facing an uncertain future, and yet they spoke of family with such natural certainty. That night, as Richard helped Margaret tuck the girls into bed, a routine that felt both foreign and surprisingly natural, he found himself thinking about the future in a way he hadn't in years. What would happen to Sarah and Lily? Would they be placed in foster care? Would they be separated? "Mr. Richard," Sarah's voice came from the darkness of the guest room. "Will you still be here tomorrow?" "Yes," he said without hesitation. "I'll be here." "Good," she whispered. "Lily has bad dreams sometimes, but she slept good last night because she knew you were here." As Richard returned to his own room, he reflected on the profound change that had occurred in his life in less than 24 hours. Two small children had stumbled into his carefully controlled world and somehow managed to stir emotions he thought he had buried forever. The protective instinct he felt toward them was both thrilling and terrifying. He had built his isolation as a fortress against further pain, but Sarah and Lily had breached those walls with nothing more than their vulnerability and trust. The question now was whether he was strong enough to let them stay, or wise enough to know what was best for them. The blizzard had passed, but Richard sensed that the real storm was just beginning. Tomorrow would bring social workers, difficult questions and decisions that would affect all their lives. But tonight, for the first time in 4 years, his house felt like a home again, filled with the sounds of children breathing softly in their sleep, trusting him to keep them safe. 3 weeks had passed since the blizzard, and Richard Whitmore's mansion had undergone a transformation that went far beyond the physical presence of 2 small children. The sterile perfection of his refuge had given way to a lived-in warmth that he had thought was lost forever. Lily's drawings covered the refrigerator door, Sarah's books were scattered across the coffee table, and the sound of their laughter echoed through halls that had known only silence for years. Richard found himself establishing routines he never thought he would embrace again. Morning breakfast conversations where Sarah would solemnly discuss the book she was reading, while Lily chatted about her dreams. Afternoon sessions in the library, where he would read to them, his voice growing stronger and more animated with each story. Evening games of checkers with Sarah, who proved to be a surprisingly strategic opponent, while Lily colored beside them, occasionally offering commentary on their moves. The investigation into their mother's disappearance had yielded heartbreaking results. Linda Morrison, their mother, had been found by search teams having succumbed to hypothermia in her desperate attempt to reach a convenience store during the storm. She had died trying to return to her daughters with the supplies she had promised to bring. The tragedy was compounded by the discovery that she had been fleeing an abusive relationship, just as Sarah had indicated. Richard had been the one to tell the girls, with Janet Morrison, the social worker, present for support. Sarah had received the news with a devastating composure that spoke of too much experience with loss, while Lily had simply asked when her mama would come home from heaven. The grief that settled over the house was palpable, but somehow it had drawn them closer together rather than driving them apart. "We're going to place them in foster care," Janet had explained to Richard during one of their regular meetings. "Sarah and Lily are sweet children, and I'm hopeful we can find them a good home together. You've provided them with stability during this difficult time, Mr. Whitmore, and I want you to know how much that means." But Richard had found himself reluctant to let them go. Each day brought new moments that reminded him of the father he had once been, helping Lily with her shoelaces, listening to Sarah's concerns about starting school, watching them play together with the unconscious joy of childhood. The house felt alive again, filled with purpose and love. "I want to apply for custody," he had told Janet during her 4th visit. "Permanent custody. I want to adopt them." Janet had been quiet for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. "Mr. Whitmore, I appreciate your attachment to these children, but adoption is a complex process. You're a single man, you have physical limitations, and you've been living in isolation for several years. The court will need to consider what's in the best interest of Sarah and Lily. And what's in their best interest is staying together, in a stable home with someone who loves them," Richard had replied firmly. "I can provide for them financially, emotionally, and physically. My disability doesn't make me incapable of being a good father. The adoption process had begun, but it was more complicated than Richard had anticipated. Home studies, psychological evaluations, financial assessments, every aspect of his life was scrutinized. Through it all, Sarah and Lily remained with him, their presence a constant reminder of what he was fighting for. Then came the day that changed everything. Richard was in his office, reviewing documents for the adoption proceedings, when Margaret knocked on his door with an expression of concern. "Mr. Whitmore, there's a man here to see you. He says he's the children's father." Richard felt the blood drain from his face. "Their father? He has a lawyer with him. They're in the living room." Richard's hands trembled as he maneuvered his wheelchair toward the living room, his mind racing. Sarah and Lily were at the kitchen table with Margaret, working on a puzzle. He could hear their voices, cheerful and content, unaware that their world was about to be upended once again. In the living room, two men stood waiting. One was clearly the lawyer, middle-aged, well-dressed, carrying a briefcase. The other was younger, perhaps in his early 30s, with dark hair and clothing that suggested he had made an effort to look respectable. His resemblance to Sarah was unmistakable. "Mr. Whitmore," the lawyer said, extending his hand. "I'm David Chen, and this is my client, Marcus Morrison. Mr. Morrison is the biological father of Sarah and Lily Morrison." Richard didn't shake the offered hand. "What do you want?" Marcus stepped forward, his expression a mixture of nervous determination and something that might have been genuine emotion. "I want my daughters back. I know I wasn't a good father before, but I've changed. I've been in counseling, I have a steady job, and I'm clean. I want to be the father they deserve." "Where were you when they were living in an abandoned building?" Richard's voice was low and controlled, but the anger beneath it was unmistakable. "Where were you when their mother was so desperate to escape an abusive situation that she died? Trying to provide for them?" "I was getting my life together," Marcus replied. "I know I have a lot to make up for, but they're my daughters. I have rights." David Chen opened his briefcase and withdrew several documents. "Mr. Whitmore, while we appreciate the care you've provided for Sarah and Lily, Mr. Morrison is their biological father. He has completed a rehabilitation program, has steady employment, and has been declared fit for custody by a court-appointed psychologist. We're prepared to begin the process of transitioning the children to his care." Richard felt as though the world was tilting beneath him. "You can't just take them. They've been through enough trauma. They need stability, not another upheaval." "They need their father," Marcus said, his voice gaining strength. "I know I wasn't there before, but I'm here now. I want to be part of their lives." The sound of footsteps announced Sarah's arrival. She appeared in the doorway, her face curious but cautious. "Mr. Richard, is everything okay?" Richard's heart clenched as he saw her expression change when she noticed Marcus. Recognition flickered across her features, followed by something that looked like fear. "Hello, Sarah," Marcus said, his voice gentler now. "Do you remember me?" Sarah moved closer to Richard's wheelchair, her small hand coming to rest on the armrest. "You're him. You're the one who made Mama cry." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Marcus's face crumpled slightly. "Sarah, I know I made mistakes, big mistakes, but I've changed. I want to be a better father to you and Lily." "Where were you?" Sarah's voice was small but steady. "Where were you when we were cold and hungry? Where were you when Mama had to hide us?" Richard watched the exchange with a mixture of pride and heartbreak. This brave little girl was articulating questions that he himself wanted to ask, but he also saw the pain in Marcus's eyes, the genuine remorse that seemed to war with his determination to reclaim his children. "I was sick," Marcus said quietly, "sick in a way that made me hurt people I loved. But I got help, Sarah. I got better. And I want to show you that I can be the daddy you deserve." Sarah looked up at Richard, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "Mr. Richard, do we have to go?" The question pierced his heart. Richard wanted to tell her that no one could make them leave, that he would fight for them with everything he had. But he also knew that the law was complicated, and that children's wishes, while important, were not always the deciding factor in custody cases. "We're going to figure this out," he said carefully. "Nobody is going anywhere today." David Chen cleared his throat. "Actually, Mr. Whitmore, we have a court order for a gradual transition. Mr. Morrison is entitled to supervised visits, starting immediately." "Supervised by whom?" Richard demanded. "By a court-appointed social worker. The visits will begin with a few hours, then gradually increase until the children are comfortable with the transition to Mr. Morrison's care." Richard felt trapped in a nightmare. The children he had come to love as his own were being legally claimed by a man who had been absent during their most vulnerable moments. Yet he could see that Marcus Morrison was not the monster he had expected. He was a man who appeared to be genuinely trying to rebuild his life and relationship with his daughters. Over the following weeks, the supervised visits began. Marcus would arrive at the house with a social worker, and he would spend time with Sarah and Lily in the living room, while Richard retreated to his office, listening to the stilted conversations and occasional laughter that filtered through the walls. Lily, with the adaptability of very young children, seemed to warm to Marcus more quickly than Sarah. She would show him her drawings and tell him about her favorite books. Sarah remained polite but distant, never quite letting her guard down, always staying within sight of Richard when possible. The custody battle that followed was emotionally exhausting. Richard hired his own attorney, a formidable woman named Patricia Hartwell, who specialized in family law. She argued that stability and continuity were in the children's best interests, that Richard had provided them with a loving home during their most traumatic period, and that disrupting their lives again would be harmful. Marcus's attorney countered that biological parents had fundamental rights, that Marcus had demonstrated his commitment to rehabilitation, and that children belonged with their biological families when possible. The courtroom became a battlefield where love was measured in legal precedents, and children's welfare was debated by people who had never tucked them into bed or kissed their scraped knees. Richard found himself questioned about his motivations, his ability to care for two young children as a single man with a disability, and his understanding of what was truly best for Sarah and Lily. "Mr. Whitmore," the judge said during one particularly difficult hearing, "while the court appreciates your genuine care for these children, we must consider whether your attachment to them is influenced by your own loss. Are you trying to replace your deceased daughter with Sarah and Lily?" The question hit Richard like a physical blow. He sat in his wheelchair, facing a courtroom full of people who would decide the fate of two children he had come to love, and wondered if there was any truth to the judge's implication. "Your Honor," he said finally, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his heart, "I cannot replace my daughter Emma. No one could. But Sarah and Lily are not replacements. They are two extraordinary children who deserve to be loved and protected. I've provided them with stability, care, and love during the most difficult period of their lives. I'm not trying to fill a void in my life. I'm trying to give them the future they deserve." The judge nodded thoughtfully. "And what about you, Mr. Morrison? What can you tell the court about your fitness to be a father to these children?" Marcus stood, his hands trembling slightly. "Your Honor, I know I failed them before. I know I wasn't the father they needed when they were born, and I know my problems contributed to the situation that led to their mother's passing. But I've spent every day since then working to become the man they deserve as a father. I've completed rehabilitation, I have a stable job, and I have a support system in place. I love my daughters, and I want the chance to prove that I can be the father they never had." The custody hearing stretched over several weeks, with testimony from social workers, psychologists, and character witnesses. Richard found himself caught between his love for the children and his growing recognition that Marcus Morrison was not the villain he had initially assumed him to be. The breakthrough came during a private conversation Richard had with Sarah while they were reading together in the library. She had been quiet for several days, clearly troubled by the court proceedings and the uncertainty surrounding her future. "Mr. Richard," she said suddenly, looking up from her book, "do you think my dad really changed?" Richard set down his book and gave her his full attention. "What do you think, Sarah?" I think maybe he did. He's different than I remember. He's nicer. And he knows things about Lily that he didn't know before, like how she likes purple and how she's afraid of thunderstorms. Sarah paused, her young face serious. But I don't want to leave you. You're the one who saved us. You're the one who makes us feel safe. Richard felt tears prick his eyes. Sarah, sweetheart, whatever happens, you and Lily will always be safe and you'll always be loved. But will we still be a family? She asked, her voice small. It was then that Richard realized what he had to do. The custody battle wasn't about winning or losing. It was about what was truly best for two children who had already lost too much. And maybe, just maybe, there was a solution that no one had considered. The solution came to Richard during one of those quiet moments that often bring the greatest clarity. He was sitting in his office, watching Sarah and Lily play in the garden, through his window, when Marcus arrived for his scheduled visit. Instead of retreating to his office as usual, Richard made a decision. That would change all their lives. "Marcus," he called out as the younger man entered the living room with the social worker, "could I speak with you privately for a moment?" Marcus looked surprised but nodded. After the social worker settled, with the children, the two men found themselves alone in Richard's study for the first time since the custody battle had begun. "I have a proposition," Richard said without preamble. "What if there was a way for both of us to be in their lives?" Marcus frowned, clearly puzzled. "I don't understand." "You're their father," Richard continued. "That's a biological truth that can't be changed, and I'm beginning to see that it shouldn't be. But they've also found stability and love here. What if we could find a way to honor both of those realities?" "Are you suggesting joint custody?" Marcus asked cautiously. "I'm suggesting something more radical than that," Richard replied. "I'm suggesting we work together to give them the family they deserve. Not a broken family divided between two homes, but a real family that puts their needs first." Marcus stared at him for a long moment. "You're talking about us becoming... what? Partners in raising them?" "I'm talking about us becoming whatever they need us to be," Richard said firmly. "You could move into the guest wing of the house. There's plenty of space, and it would allow you to be a daily presence in their lives while maintaining the stability they've found here. We could co-parent them, both of us contributing our strengths to their upbringing." The suggestion hung in the air between them. Marcus walked to the window, looking out at Sarah and Lily, who were building a snowman with animated enthusiasm. "Why would you do that?" Marcus asked quietly. "Why would you share them when you could fight to keep them for yourself?" Richard was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "Because I've learned something these past few months. Love isn't about possession. It's about doing what's best for the people you care about, even when it's difficult. Those children have lost their mother, and they've been through more trauma than any child should endure. They need stability, love, and security. If we can provide that together better than either of us could alone, then that's what we should do." Marcus turned back to face him. "And what about the practical aspects? This is your home, your space. You'd be giving up your privacy, your independence." "I gave up my independence 4 years ago," Richard said simply. "What I gained these past months is something far more valuable, a sense of purpose, a reason to engage with life again. Sarah and Lily didn't just find shelter in my home, they saved me from a kind of emotional hibernation that was slowly killing me." The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. Sarah peered in, her cheeks flushed from the cold air outside. "Mr. Richard, Daddy Marcus," she said, using the tentative name she had begun to call him. "Lily wants to know if you'll both come see our snowman. She says it looks like a superhero." Richard and Marcus exchanged a look, both thinking the same thing. The children had unconsciously given them their answer. They didn't want to choose between their father and the man who had become their protector. They wanted both. "Will you?" "Be right there," Richard said, and Sarah's face lit up with genuine joy. The legal arrangements took several weeks to finalize, but eventually a unique custody agreement was reached. Marcus would have full parental rights, but he would exercise them while living in the Whitmore mansion, with Richard serving as a guardian and co-parent. It was an unconventional arrangement that required approval from the court, but ultimately the judge agreed that it served the children's best interests. The transition wasn't without its challenges. Marcus had to adjust to living in luxury after years of struggle. while Richard had to learn to share the space and the children he had come to consider his own. There were moments of tension, disagreements about parenting approaches, and the inevitable awkwardness of two men learning to coexist in what had been a solitary sanctuary. But gradually something beautiful began to emerge. Marcus brought energy and spontaneity to the household that complemented Richard's stability and resources. He taught the girls to ride bicycles in the spring, helped them build elaborate pillow forts, and shared stories about their mother that kept her memory alive in healthy ways. Richard provided the educational foundation they needed, helping Sarah with her reading and encouraging her love of books, while patiently working with Lily on her numbers and letters. His business acumen proved invaluable in planning for their futures, setting up education funds, and ensuring they would have every opportunity to pursue their dreams. The children flourished in this unconventional family structure. Sarah's wariness gradually gave way to trust, and she began to call Richard Papa Richard and Marcus Daddy. Lily, with her natural adaptability, seamlessly accepted both men as her fathers, often crawling onto Richard's lap while Marcus read to them or holding both their hands during walks around the property. The revelation that would forever change their understanding of family came 6 months after Marcus had moved in. Richard was going through some of his old business papers when he discovered a file he had forgotten about background checks he had run on potential employees years ago. One name caught his attention: Linda Morrison. She had worked for one of his subsidiary companies briefly over 8 years ago. As he read through her employment records, pieces of a puzzle began to fall into place. The timing of her employment, her background, her age, everything aligned with what he knew about Sarah and Lily's mother. When he brought this discovery to Marcus, the revelation was even more startling. Marcus confirmed that Linda had briefly worked for a tech company during their relationship, and that she had often mentioned a boss who had been kind to her during a difficult time in her life. She used to say that there was this man who gave her time off when Sarah was born, even though she hadn't been there long enough to qualify for maternity leave, Marcus said, his voice filled with wonder. She said he was in a wheelchair, and that he understood what it was like to face challenges. She always said she wished she could thank him properly. The connection was profound and almost mystical. Linda Morrison had briefly worked for Richard Whitmore years ago, and in her final act of desperation, she had unknowingly led her children to the one person who would understand their needs and have the resources to help them. This revelation brought a new dimension to their family bond. Richard felt a connection to Linda that transcended their brief professional relationship. She had been a mother trying to protect her children, just as Catherine had been. And now, in a way, he was able to honor both women by providing the love and security their children needed. The first year of their unconventional family arrangement passed with remarkable harmony. The house that had once been a monument to isolation became a hub of activity and love. Sarah excelled in school, her intelligence and resilience earning her recognition from teachers who marveled at her maturity and kindness. Lily blossomed into a confident, creative child whose artwork covered every available surface in the house. Marcus found purpose in his new role as a full-time father. He enrolled in community college to pursue a degree in education, inspired by his daughter's love of learning. Richard supported his studies both financially and emotionally, often helping him with assignments and celebrating his academic achievements. The transformation in Richard was perhaps the most remarkable of all. The man who had withdrawn from life after losing his wife and daughter gradually emerged as a loving patriarch who found joy in school plays, birthday parties, and the everyday chaos of raising children. His business empire continued to thrive, but it was no longer his sole focus. He had found something more valuable than wealth. He had found family. One evening, as autumn painted the Vermont landscape in brilliant colors, the four of them were sitting in the living room. Sarah was reading to Lily from a book about brave princesses, while Marcus helped Richard with a puzzle that had been challenging them for weeks. The fire crackled in the fireplace, and the house was filled with the comfortable sounds of a family at peace. "Papa Richard," Lily said suddenly, looking up from her book, "are you happy?" Richard set down his puzzle piece and looked around the room at the three people who had become his world. "Yes, sweetheart, I'm very happy, are you?" The happiest, Lily declared, with the absolute certainty of childhood. Sarah looked up from her book. "Daddy Marcus, do you miss living somewhere else?" Marcus reached over and ruffled her hair. "This is home now, Sarah. This is where our family is." The word family no longer felt strange or complicated. It simply felt right. As the children prepared for bed that night, Richard found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them all together. A blizzard had deposited 2 frightened children at his door, and in saving them, he had discovered that he needed saving too. Marcus had arrived as a potential threat, only to become a partner in the most important work of their lives, raising 2 extraordinary children. The adoption papers were finalized the following spring, making Richard officially Sarah and Lily's adoptive father while Marcus retained his parental rights. The legal designation mattered less than the reality they had created. A family bound not by blood alone, but by choice, commitment, and love. At the adoption ceremony, held in the same courthouse where they had once battled for custody, the judge commented on the unique nature of their arrangement. "In 30 years on the bench," she said, "I've never seen a case quite like this. 2 men who could have been adversaries chose instead to become partners in the sacred work of raising children. Sarah and Lily are fortunate to have not just one father, but 2 men who love them enough to put their needs first." As they left the courthouse that day, Sarah walking between her 2 fathers while Lily skipped ahead, Richard felt a profound sense of completion. His life had been broken by tragedy, but it had been rebuilt by love in a way he never could have imagined. The mansion in Vermont was no longer a refuge from the world. It was a launching pad for 4 lives that had found their purpose in each other. And sometimes, on quiet winter evenings when the snow fell softly outside the windows, Richard would remember that terrible blizzard that had brought them together and marvel at how something so destructive could lead to something so beautiful. He had lost a daughter and gained 2. Marcus had lost his way and found his purpose. Sarah and Lily had lost their mother, but found a family that would never let them face the world alone. In the end, they had all discovered that the heart of home isn't a place, it's the people who choose to love you no matter what. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope that Richard, Marcus, Sarah, and Lily's story has touched your hearts as deeply as it has touched ours. This tale of unexpected family, second chances, and the transformative power of love reminds us that sometimes the most beautiful families are the ones we choose to create together. If this story resonated with you, we invite you to join our community by subscribing to our channel and giving this video a thumbs up. We bring you new stories every day that explore the depths of human connection and the triumph of love over adversity. Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear how this story made you feel, or if you have your own experiences with unconventional families that have shaped your life. Don't miss our upcoming stories by hitting the notification bell, and remember that every family's journey is unique and beautiful.